You want to play hardball with water rights? Fine. Let's see how your pristine lakeside resort looks when it's nothing more than a muddy parking lot. I'm standing beside a century-old dam valve, the very mechanism controlling the entire lake system that feeds Willowbrook Resort, the crown jewel in our HOA board president's multi-million-dollar vacation empire. Earlier today, while I was at my daughter's cancer treatment, they bulldozed my great-grandfather's barn. They called it an emergency demolition for community safety. What they don't realize is that my family built this dam in 1924 and we still hold the original water rights. Karen Whitmore, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, just made the worst mistake of her meticulously polished life. She thinks she can push around a grieving single dad. She's about to find out why you never challenge a man who's lost everything, a broken bar, and has everything to gain. The first thing that hit me was the smell of diesel fumes mingled with fresh sawdust, and something that made my chest ache. I pulled into my driveway, Emma leaning wearily against the passenger side window after her chemo session, and saw it. A massive yellow excavator squatting where my great-grandfather's barn had stood for nearly a century. Around it lay a heap of century-old timber, wood that had survived storms, floods, and time itself. The sight hit me so hard my knees nearly buckled. That barn wasn't just lumber, it was a living piece of my family's history, my last tangible connection to my father, who passed away in that same hospital just 6 months ago. Every summer as a kid, I'd be in that barn with him, learning how to use his tools, hearing stories about great-grandpa William and the days when neighbors built things together that lasted a lifetime. Dad, your broken bar, where's great-grandpa's barn? Emma's voice was soft but sharp as a blade. I had promised her we would restore that barn together when she got better. During every hospital visit, we'd talk about sanding down the wood, adding solar panels, turning it into her art studio. Now, all that remained were splinters scattered across the grass, memories shattered like broken promises. I could still hear my dad's last words before cancer took him. That barn holds our family's history, son. Promise me you'll take care of it. And in one afternoon, I'd failed him. A broken bar failed our legacy. A construction worker in a hard hat jogged over, clipboard in hand. You Marcus Sullivan? Sorry about the timing, man. Here's your paperwork. He shoved a manila envelope at me, backing away like he knew I might blow up. Smart. I was close. The envelope felt heavy in my hands, the kind of weight that changes everything. I tore it open right there in the driveway. Emma was watching me, her eyes wide with something beyond exhaustion. She understood this wasn't just about a building. Kids with cancer learn to read adult faces like survival manuals. The header screamed back at me in bold red, "Emergency demolition notice issued by the Willowbrook Homeowners Association, citing structural safety concerns and community flood risk." They claimed multiple attempts to reach me by certified mail and in person. A blatant lie. I'd been home all week except for today. They'd waited until I was at Emma's treatment so I couldn't intervene. Daddy, did they take pictures first? Emma asked, already pulling out her phone to document the scene. The notice, the scattered beams, even the excavator's license plate. Even weak from chemo, she was sharper than most adults. Marcus, a voice called from across the street. Betty Chen came hurrying over, her silver hair streaming behind her, phone clutched in her hand like it held the truth itself. I took pictures, she panted. I saw Karen here last week with a surveyor and some architect. They were measuring everything, talking about maximizing lakefront access for premium guests. I knew something was brewing. Behind Betty, neighbors were gathering, some looking shocked, others deliberately turning away. The lines were already being drawn. Betty showed me her phone, photos of Karen on my property with two men in expensive suits. One held a tablet, the other a measuring wheel. They pointed at the barn, then toward the lake, then back again. The photos proved Karen had been planning this long before today. Betty, send me those pictures, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. And do you remember exactly what they said about lakefront access? I walked to the rubble, Emma trailing quietly behind. Some of the larger beams had survived the demolition. I knelt, running my hand over a piece of hand-hewn timber, the marks from tools nearly a century old still visible beneath the dust. Carved into one of the surviving beams, worn smooth by time, were the letters WSWS 1924, my great-grandfather's mark. William Sullivan, the man who had raised this barn with his own hands during the roaring 20s. I closed my eyes and could almost picture him, sleeves rolled to the elbow, sweat on his brow, working in the summer heat because he believed in building for the generations yet to come. Dad, you're broken bar, why would they do this? Emma leaned against me, her bald head warm against my shoulder. The chemo had stolen her beautiful red hair, but it couldn't touch her determination. Most days she was stronger than I was, which made what Karen had done even more enraging. She hadn't just torn down a building, she had ripped apart a piece of history while my daughter was fighting for her life. Emma picked up a fragment of the carved timber, tracing the initials with her small finger. Great-great-grandpa would be mad, wouldn't he? He built this for us, and they just threw it away. I don't know yet, sweetheart, I told her. But I'm going to find out. I rose, brushing the sawdust from my jeans. Something shifted deep inside me. The heavy grief I'd been carrying since Dad passed was still there, but now it had an edge, a purpose. If Karen Whitmore wanted a fight, she had chosen the wrong Sullivan. My family had been defending this land for 4 generations, and I wasn't about to let a power-drunk president erase that legacy. I pulled out my phone and began taking my own photos of the wreckage, the so-called emergency notice, the excavator squatting on my land like a conquering army. If Karen wanted to play her games with official paperwork and legal loopholes, I could play too. Tank Rodriguez walked over from 3 houses down, his face set in grim lines. A Marine veteran who had served 3 tours before returning to work construction, Tank had a calm, steady presence that made people feel safer just by standing near him. "Brother, I saw what happened," he said, scanning the debris with the eye of a professional. "That was old-growth timber, worth a fortune. You don't use equipment like this for a real emergency demolition, you use it when you want to send a message." He knelt, lifting one of the splintered beams. "See this? They didn't just tear it down, they made sure you couldn't reuse a single piece. This was personal." Betty stepped closer and squeezed my arm. "Mark, you saw broken bar, there's more." Yesterday, I overheard Karen on the phone. She was talking about a Phase 2 expansion and how she needed to secure Sullivan property within 90 days before summer season. She didn't notice me watering my flowers, but I heard every word. It all made sense now. Karen hadn't just wanted the barn gone, she wanted the entire property. The barn was only her opening move. I looked around at the watching neighbors, some nodding in silent support, others turning away and retreating indoors. The lines in this fight were already being drawn. "Daddy, what's that?" Emma's voice pulled me back. She was pointing to something half buried under broken boards. I knelt and uncovered a dented metal lockbox, somehow spared from the destruction. The lock was busted, so I pried it open. Inside were yellowed photographs and brittle papers that made my hands tremble. There was my great-grandfather, standing proudly beside the newly built barn, shaking hands with men in suits. There were construction photos of the water system. At the very bottom lay a folded document bearing county seals and formal signatures. I glanced again at the demolition notice. In the fine print, it demanded immediate compliance with mandatory safety upgrades, an estimated cost of $75,000. Failure to comply within 30 days meant further enforcement actions. That was more than I'd earned in the last half year, balancing Emma's care and medical bills. Karen knew exactly what she was doing, pushing me into financial collapse so she could take the land. But now, holding the contents of that lockbox, I realized she might have overplayed her hand. She had been so focused on tearing down the barn, she hadn't considered what secrets might be hidden inside it. "Come on, Em," I said, helping her up the front steps. Her small hand felt colder than usual, and I thought about Dr. Hernandez's warning the next few months would be critical. The last thing I needed was a war with the HOA. But it looked like war was exactly what I was getting. I settled Emma on the couch with a blanket and her tablet, then stood at the window, staring at the ruins. The demolition crew was loading their gear, ready to go home to their families. One operator glanced back at me, his face showing something almost like regret. Maybe he was just doing his job. A broken bar, but he had destroyed something that had survived the Great Depression, World War II, the moon landing, 9/11 and everything in between. It had survived all of that, a broken bar, until it met Karen Whitmore's ambition. I spread the documents out on the kitchen table. The more I studied them, the more I suspected that my great-grandfather had been a step ahead of people like her. William Sullivan had built for the future, and maybe just maybe he'd built in safeguards no HOA president could bulldoze. The basement still smelled like Dad's pipe tobacco and old secrets. I'd avoided it since the funeral. A broken bar. Do you want me to? I'd been avoiding the basement since the funeral, but Betty's words about how the old-timers always hid something valuable kept playing in my head. Dad was the type who cataloged everything, records, receipts, even scraps of family history. If there was a detail Karen didn't know about our land, it would be hidden somewhere down here, buried among the boxes and filing cabinets that held 4 generations of Sullivan history. I started with the obvious: property deeds, tax records, insurance forms, all the standard paperwork that painted a picture of careful, consistent ownership. But then my eyes caught on something different: a heavy metal lockbox wedged behind a stack of my old college textbooks. The lock was old but still solid, its edges spotted with rust. I remembered Dad showing me this box once, when I was about Emma's age. He'd told me it contained family papers you'll need someday. He'd even told me where the key was, and sure enough, it was still taped under the workbench, exactly where he'd said. Inside, wrapped in an oiled cloth like some kind of treasure, were documents that made my pulse quicken. The first was a hand-drawn map dated 1924, detailing every pipe, valve, and channel connecting the lake to surrounding properties. At the bottom, in my great-grandfather's careful script, W. Sullivan, a chief water engineer, Willowbrook County Water Trust. The second document was even bigger. It was a formal contract between William Sullivan and the county, granting the Sullivan family perpetual water easement and emergency management authority over the entire lake system. It carried the signatures of the county commissioner, the state water authority, and 3 influential local businessmen. The language was old-fashioned, but the meaning was clear. My family had legal control over the water that kept Karen's precious resort alive. Holy, I stopped myself mid-curse, feeling guilty for swearing in Dad's space. But these a broken bar. This was massive. Karen thought the hoe gave her the upper hand. She had no idea she'd been playing with half a deck. My great-grandfather hadn't just owned land, he'd engineered the entire system that made the lake possible. Without him, there wouldn't even be a resort for her to profit from. The third paper brought the first real smile to my face in days: a letter from the county commissioner, dated 1925. Thanking William Sullivan for his service and confirming that all water management rights and responsibilities shall pass to his heirs in perpetuity. It even mentioned the emergency control valve located on our property, calling it vital for flood control and public safety. "Daddy?" Emma's small voice came from the top of the basement steps. She was pale, but alert, her chemo meds making her sleeping patterns unpredictable. I climbed up and showed her the papers, explaining their meaning in the simplest terms I could. Her eyes lit up. So Broken Bar great-great-grandpa was like the boss of the whole lake? That's so cool. Does that mean we can tell Karen she can't have our land? Right to the point. Emma had summed up exactly what mattered. It means we have options, I said, but first, I need to have a little talk with our dear HOA president. I tucked Emma back into bed, then sat at the kitchen table, the documents spread out like battle plans. Karen had already called an emergency HOA meeting for the next evening, and no doubt to push her narrative about safety concerns and my supposed refusal to comply with their upgrade orders. She'd be expecting me to show up beaten down, maybe even ready to sell. When the time came, I walked into the community center with a manila folder tucked under my arm, and Emma right beside me. I'd asked Tank to keep her company during the meeting, but she'd shaken her head. "I want to see you tell Karen about great-great-grandpa," she'd said. How could I argue with that? If watching her dad stand up to a bully gave her even an ounce of strength, she deserved front row seats. Karen sat at the head of the room like a CEO presiding over a hostile takeover, flanked by two board members who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. About 30 neighbors filled the folding chairs, waiting for the show to begin. The folding chairs were nearly full, neighbors shifting uncomfortably as Karen presided over the meeting. She had called everyone together, but from the uneasy glances around the room, it was clear not everyone believed her version of the community safety story. I rose to my feet, Emma's small hand tightening around mine for encouragement. Thank you, Karen, for that imaginative presentation, I began, letting my tone carry just enough edge. I especially liked the part where you described my great-grandfather's barn as an unauthorized structure. That's curiouser because, according to the records I found, William Sullivan built that barn in 1924 as part of his official duties as chief water engineer for the Willowbrook County Water Trust. The room went still. Karen's polished smile wavered, though she recovered quickly. Perhaps you'd like to explain, I continued, why you demolished a structure that was not only legally constructed but was a key component of the original water management system, the very system your resort relies on. I opened my folder and laid out photocopies of the documents. Karen's cheeks flushed crimson. Those could be forgeries, she snapped. Old papers are easy to fake, Betty, I said, turning toward her. Betty Chen stood, phone in hand. I have photos of Karen meeting with surveyors and architects on Marcus property last week before any supposed emergency demolition was necessary. The next morning, I became a quick study in Facebook Live, with Emma helping set the perfect camera angle to capture the pile of barn rubble in the background. She'd insisted on doing her makeup, determined to look strong for what she called Daddy's movie. My heart swelled at her resilience. All right, folks, I began, holding the camera steady. Let's talk about water rights and what happens when HOA presidents think they're above the law. I lifted the original 1924 documents into view. My name is Marcus Sullivan. A few days ago, the Willowbrook HOA tore down my great-grandfather's barn while I was at my daughter's cancer treatment. They called it an emergency demolition for community safety. The viewer count started climbing. Tankard shared the stream instantly, followed by Betty, Rick, and dozens of neighbors. The comments section lit up with outrage and fire emojis. Here's what they didn't tell you, I said, moving so the demolished barn framed me perfectly. William Sullivan, my great-grandfather, designed and built the entire water system that created this lake. He held perpetual water rights, which passed down to his heirs. That's me. That's my daughter Emma. I gestured toward her, and she waved at the camera, her smile radiant despite her treatments. The comments filled with hearts and words of support. And if you're wondering why the HOA president would risk legal action to destroy a historic barn, I pulled out Rick's flash drive and read aloud from a printed email. Karen Whitmore to Investor Group. Phase 2 expansion requires lakefront access. The Sullivan property is the key. Barn demolition scheduled during his daughter's treatment. Emergency clause gives us legal cover. The viewer count surged. The anger in the comments was palpable. Karen had made a fatal error. Targeting a single dad and his sick child was the kind of thing people didn't forgive. So here's my plan, I continued, walking toward the lake. Those water rights my great-grandfather secured, they give me emergency management authority over the entire lake system, including the water supply to Willowbrook Resort. I stopped at the fence line where Karen's property began. Beautiful place here, boats, cabins. The whole works are powered entirely by the water system my family built. I'm not going to break the law. I'm not going to damage anything. But I will exercise my legal rights as water trustee. And Karen Whitmore will learn that actions have consequences. The live stream ended with Emma and me standing before the wreckage, destruction behind us, resolve ahead. By the next day, the video had gone viral locally. Facebook groups buzzed with debates about HOA overreach and property rights. Karen's counterattack came swiftly. A certified letter from her lawyers threatening lawsuits for defamation, privacy violations, and inciting unrest. They demanded I take down the video and issue a public apology. She'd even filed a formal complaint with the county about unauthorized modification of water infrastructure despite the fact that I hadn't touched a thing. That afternoon, I decided to take a closer look. Literally, Emma and I walked to the old valve system, her iPad ready to record. Just as the 1924 map indicated, it was hidden behind a small maintenance shed most people would assume belonged to the county. And then, early one morning, a black SUV rolled up in front of my house like a shadow of whatever move Karen was planning next. The black SUV parked outside looked like it belonged in a political thriller. Tinted windows, idling engine, and a man inside built like he could deadlift a refrigerator for fun. Before long, new security cameras appeared on utility poles, each with a perfect view of my front door, the backyard, and the path to the lake. Emma peeked through the living room curtains. "Daddy, why is that man just sitting there?" "Because Karen thinks she can scare us into giving up," I told her, keeping my voice even while my temper burned. "She's about to find out that Sullivans don't break that easily." That was just her opening move. Soon after, every neighbor received a slick, full-color pamphlet titled Marcus Sullivan, a threat assessment. 8 pages of carefully worded propaganda painted me as some unhinged troublemaker. The cover used a still from my Facebook live video, edited so I looked shadowy and dangerous, with water terrorist stamped across it in angry red text. Hank brought me a copy, his expression grim. "Brother, this is psychological warfare. And it's expensive." Inside were fabricated quotes from concerned residents, cherry-picked engineering opinions about flood risks, and a so-called record of my increasingly erratic behavior. She even dragged Emma's illness into it, hinting that family stress made me unstable and a danger to the community. There was a section accusing me of using social media to radicalize people, turning my live stream into something that read like an extremist recruitment pitch. The isolation was fast and sharp. Emma's best friend Zoe didn't show up for their usual art afternoon. When Emma called, Zoe's mother answered in a clipped tone, "I'm sorry, Emma, but Zoe won't be able to come over anymore. Your father's behavior is making a lot of families uncomfortable." Emma hung up, eyes brimming with tears. "Mrs. Peterson says I can't be friends with Zoe because you're dangerous." Am I not allowed to have friends anymore? That was it. Karen had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. She hadn't just targeted me, she had gone after my 12-year-old. During the hardest time of her life, something in me shifted, colder than anger, sharper than any plan I'd made before. I knelt so I could look Emma in the eye. "Some people are afraid of the truth, sweetheart. They're scared of standing up for what's right. Mrs. Peterson isn't a bad persona, she's just scared. But scared people don't get to decide what's right and wrong." Not long after, I got my hands on Karen's grand project, a 47-page petition to the county court, asking for my property to be seized under eminent domain. It was polished, professional, and full of lies. There were staged photographs, forged engineering reports, and sworn statements claiming my land was a public safety hazard. The petition said my property was critical for flood control upgrades, and that my refusal to comply with necessary safety regulations endangered the entire community. The proposed improvements came with a $2.3 million price tag, to be paid through special community assessments, conveniently skipping over any of Karen's resort holdings. The worst part? She twisted Emma's illness into her justification. A section argued that families with medical emergencies needed guaranteed emergency access routes, using my daughter's cancer treatments as a prop in her land grab. That's when Tank knocked on my truck window, with Betty, Rick, and about a dozen other neighbors behind him, people I never thought I'd see united. "Marcus, we've been talking," Tank said. "This pamphlet is garbage. We all know it." Karen's crossed the line. Betty stepped forward, clutching a thick folder. "I've been digging." Her resort claims tax losses every year, but her Instagram shows constant guests and expensive remodels. "I think she's cheating the IRS." Rick added, "The hardware store sees everything. She's been buying surveillance gear, printing supplies, all in cash. And she's been asking questions about water shut-off valves and emergency access codes. If you want, I can keep the momentum and rewrite the next section so the tension escalates smoothly. The phone shattered my sleep in the middle of the night. Dr. Hernandez's voice was steady, but I could hear the urgency beneath it. Marcus, you need to bring Emma to the hospital right away. Yesterday's blood work showed some concerning changes. Emma was already awake, sitting up in bed with that uncanny awareness kids in her situation seem to have. Is it time, Daddy? She asked quietly. I realized she'd understood more than I'd ever admitted. We talked about this moment to the point when her body would demand the bone marrow transplant. The next hours dissolved into a haze of medical terms and heavy decisions. Her white cell count had plummeted. Her body was losing the fight against leukemia, and waiting any longer wasn't an option. The transplant will cost roughly $500,000. Dr. Hernandez told me, lowering her voice. With insurance approval, your share would be around $50,000. Without a tar broken bar she didn't need to finish. No approval meant Emma wouldn't survive, and I'd spend the rest of my life buried under the debt of trying. I called the insurance company from Emma's hospital room while she slept. An hour of transfers and hold music led me to Linda Morrison, the supervisor handling her case. Her tone was all business, calm, polite, and completely unmoved. Mr. Sullivan, your daughter's file is under extended review due to concerns about your family's financial stability and community support systems. The phrase community support systems hit me like a punch. Karen had found a way into my daughter's medical file. That afternoon, she appeared at the hospital carrying flowers and wearing her most sincere neighborly smile. Marcus, I'm so sorry about Emma, she said, settling herself into a chair without an invitation. I know we've had our disagreements, but moments like these are when a community should come together. She leaned forward. I've spoken to Linda Morrison, an old college friend. She's very concerned about Emma's approval process. Now, I can help make sure there are no delays. Beauty broken bar. She paused, savoring the moment. We'd need to put our neighborhood disputes to rest. $750,000 for your property, a fair market value plus extra for your trouble. The sale would show financial stability and community cooperation, and Emma's insurance approval would go through immediately. You're holding my daughter's medical care hostage so you can take my land, I said. I'm offering a solution for both of us, she replied coolly. The transplant window won't stay open forever. After she left, Emma looked at me. She's not trying to help me, is she? No, sweetheart. She's using you. I heard her in the hallway, Emma said. She was talking about a pressure points and an inevitable conclusion. I think she's trying to hurt us. That evening, Tank arrived with Jennifer Hayes. She spread documents across the small hospital table. Marcus, we've found the link, she said. Karen's resort business donated $50,000 to Blue Cross's Community Health Initiative here the same week Emma's claim was flagged. And the money was earmarked for aid deserving families in their coverage area. The pattern was undeniable. Karen hadn't just crossed a line, she'd built her entire plan on stepping over it. Emma, pretending to sleep, whispered, Dad, your broken bar, what would great-great-grandpa do? I thought of William Sullivan, who'd spent his own money to build things that would help the community for generations. He'd protect his family first, I said. But he'd also make sure no bully could use their power to hurt people. Emma reached for Jennifer's phone. Can I record a message? I want people to know what Karen is doing to us. That night, I couldn't sleep. Her words kept circling in my head as she's using my sickness to steal our home. Karen had crossed the final line. She turned my daughter's fight for her life into a bargaining chip. Emma lay asleep in her hospital bed, surrounded by tubes and blinking monitors like some sterile fortress. Something cold and resolute settled deep in my chest. The time for compromise had passed. If Karen wanted to gamble with water rights, finally she was about to learn what happens when someone threatens a Sullivan's family. The walk to the dam valve felt almost ceremonial. My flashlight beam sliced through the darkness, tracing the same path my great-grandfather had walked more than a century earlier when he built the system to serve this community. Just where his hand-drawn map had promised, I found it tucked away behind decades of wild brush. The old valve looked like it belonged in an industrial museum, a massive iron wheel paired with brass fittings weathered to a green patina. This was the beating heart of the lake system, controlling the water flow to every property on the HOA, including Karen's prized resort. I ran my fingers over the chilled metal, feeling the history etched into every dent and scratch. William Sullivan had insisted such power remain manual, believing that decisions with this much impact should require a human hand, human judgment, and human responsibility. The wheel resisted at first, rust and corrosion fighting me like a stubborn old guardian. But persistence runs in our blood. I leaned in with my full weight, forcing decades of grit to yield until, at last, the mechanism began to turn. Each rotation carried more than just water, it carried a message: family, dignity, and a child's right to live are not bargaining chips. I thought of Emma, battling for her life while Karen twisted her illness into a political game. I thought of William, who built this dam for the community's benefit, and of Karen Whitmore, trying to twist it for her own gain. Every turn of the wheel felt like restoring balance, like justice grinding into place. The valve sealed shut with a final, sharp click, echoing in the still night like a judge's gavel. The silence that followed was profound. No more water, no more fueling the empire Karen had built on greed. I stood there, breathing hard, feeling the weight of a century's legacy settle squarely on my shoulders. Tonight, I was using my great-grandfather's creation for the same purpose he intended to protect, even if it meant making someone face the cost of their ambition. By morning, her resort was a picture of ruin. The infinity pool had dropped 4 feet, revealing algae-stained concrete. Lawns turned brown under the sun, sprinklers ticking uselessly against empty pipes. The golf course looked scorched, its water hazards reduced to cracked mud, where expensive koi flopped in shrinking puddles. Guests fled with their suitcases, abandoning what had been a carefully groomed paradise. Karen's call came, her voice high-pitched with fury. "You psychopath! You're ruining people's vacations. I'll have you arrested for sabotage." "You tried to ruin my daughter's life," I said evenly, watching sunlight spill over the empty lake. "Now you know what it feels like when someone controls what you need." The reservoir she once used as a weapon against me was now nothing but mud and echo, so exactly as I'd promised. "Turn it back on immediately, Orla." "You'll what?" "Call your friend at the insurance company," I cut in. "It's over, Karen." I ended the call and drove back to the hospital with something I hadn't felt in months: a hope. Hope for Emma, and hope that our community could survive people like her. The next day, I was ready to stand before the county commissioners with everything I had. Karen had assumed grief would weaken me. She was about to learn that sometimes, when you've lost almost everything, you discover how strong you really are. The meeting room overflowed with people, the air buzzing with anticipation. Emma's recorded message had spread online, and the idea of a neighborhood leader holding a child's treatment hostage had struck a deep nerve. Jennifer's live stream had already drawn thousands of viewers before the meeting even began. Emma sat beside me in her wheelchair, wearing her favorite purple dress and a baseball cap that read Team Sullivan, a gift from Tank's Marine buddies who'd driven hours to be there. Weak as she was, she'd insisted on coming. "Great-great-grandpa would want me here," she'd said. Karen entered with an entourage, looking like the CEO of a hostile takeover. Karen entered with 3 lawyers in tow, 2 men in sharp, expensive suits who looked like investors, and a woman carrying a briefcase who kept glancing at her phone. Karen herself wore a tailored business suit, carefully projecting the image of a concerned, responsible community leader. Commissioner Bradley called the meeting to order. "We are here to address concerns regarding water rights management and HOA governance in the Willowbrook area. Mr. Sullivan, you requested this forum. Please begin." I rose to my feet, folder of evidence in hand. "Commissioners, my name is Marcus Sullivan. 5 weeks ago, the Willowbrook HOA tore down my great-grandfather's barn while I was away with my daughter for her cancer treatments. They claimed it was an emergency demolition for safety, but the documents I'm about to present show it had been planned for months, a part of a calculated attempt to force my family off our land. I laid out the proof: Karen's covered property surveys, the fraudulent emergency demolition notice, and impossible financial demands. I followed that with the original 1924 water rights documents, the county contract guaranteeing my family's perpetual easement, and evidence of her Phase 2 resort expansion plans. Then I shifted to what mattered most. My daughter Emma needs a bone marrow transplant. Our insurance company has been delaying approval for this life-saving procedure. I have evidence that Mrs. Whitmore has been in direct contact with insurance executives, discussing our family's stability and a community cooperation. The room filled with angry murmurs. Someone shouted, "That's sick." Another voice added, "She's using a kid's illness." I played Emma's recorded message. Her small, steady voice filled the hall. "My name is Emma Sullivan. I have leukemia, and I need a bone marrow transplant to live. Mrs. Whitmore is making my daddy choose between saving me and keeping our land. She's using my sickness to take our home. That's not fair, and it's not right." When the recording ended, the silence was heavy. Commissioners and audience members alike had tears in their eyes. Karen's face had lost its confident sheen. Her carefully crafted image was crumbling. I continued, "I've also uncovered ongoing violations of federal water management laws. Mrs. Whitmore's resort has been taking more water than permitted and making unauthorized changes to the intake system. These violations have been occurring for 3 years, causing environmental harm and putting her at risk of federal charges." I handed over EPA inspection reports obtained by Jennifer through Freedom of Information requests. Commissioner Martinez turned to Karen. "Mrs. Whitmore, would you like to respond?" She stood, her voice sharp but showing cracks. "Commissioners, Mr. Sullivan is emotionally unstable because of his personal situation. He's been tampering with the water supply and making reckless changes to critical infrastructure. My only goal has been to protect this community from his erratic actions." I held up my phone. "With your permission, I'd like to play 2 recordings, are both legally obtained under our state's one-party consent law." The first recording came through loud and clear. "Marcus needs to understand that cooperation with the community affects everything: a property values, insurance approvals, even medical care priorities. Families who work with the HOA receive better support in emergencies." The second was even worse for her. "Linda, it's Karen about the Sullivan insurance claim. Their participation in community projects is questionable. They've resisted neighborhood improvements, and there are concerns about their long-term stability. A prolonged review might help them see the importance of cooperation." The room erupted. Commissioners were speaking over one another, audience members were shouting, and Karen's lawyers were frantically whispering in her ear. Karen snapped. "I was protecting this community," she yelled, her voice echoing off the chamber walls. "After I lost my son, this place became everything to me. I won't let anyone tear down what I've built. And if Marcus Sullivan thinks he can use his sick daughter to manipulate this community, he's wrong. I've worked too hard to let one emotional father ruin everything." Silence crashed over the room. Even her attorneys stared at her in disbelief. Emma reached for my hand and squeezed it. Commissioner Bradley's tone was icy. "Mrs. Whitmore, did you just admit to using a child's medical condition as leverage in a property dispute?" Karen's face froze, realizing her mistake. But the damage was done. Jennifer's live stream had just broadcast her words to over 12,000 viewers. The fallout was swift. Within 2 days, the FBI had opened a federal investigation into her water rights violations and possible public corruption. The state attorney general launched a tax fraud probe. The county stripped her of her whole leadership role and placed the entire board under direct oversight. The most unexpected victory came from Linda Morrison, the insurance supervisor who had been stalling Emma's treatment. She called me personally to say that Emma's bone marrow transplant had been moved to top priority and would be completely covered. Blue Cross had decided it wanted no association with anything that could be seen as medical extortion. Emma's surgery was set, and Dr. Hernandez confirmed that I would be her donor. We were a perfect match. She called it a gift from genetics and love. Emma just smiled and said, Great-great-grandpa is still looking out for us, isn't he? Meanwhile, Karen's resort empire began to collapse. The EPA filed federal charges over environmental violations, hitting her with fines so steep she had to sell off assets. The tax fraud probe uncovered 3 years of hidden income, leading to criminal charges and property seizures. But the final blow came from her own investors who, once the viral video of her public meltdown spread, they pulled their funding and demanded immediate repayment of their loans. With legal bills mounting and no lifeline, Karen was forced to sell everything she owned. Emma's transplant went flawlessly. Within weeks, her blood counts returned to normal, and her hair started to grow back in curly and ridder just like her mother's had been. She celebrated by painting watercolor scenes of the lake, saying she wanted to remember why her great-great-grandfather had built it for everyone. The county commissioners unanimously approved the water rights transfer from William Sullivan's will, turning the lake system into a public trust managed by an elected board. I was chosen as the first water trustee, carrying on my great-grandfather's mission. Karen, meanwhile, pled guilty to federal corruption charges and was sentenced to prison. She lost her properties, her business, her reputation, and her freedom. The day Emma came home from the hospital, the entire neighborhood gathered in our backyard for a welcome home barbecue. Tank organized it, but it turned into a full community celebration. Kids played in the lake, families shared food, and neighbors discussed plans for the new water board. Months later, we opened the William Sullivan Community Center on the very spot where Karen had destroyed the old barn. Inside were historical exhibits on the creation of the lake, modern meeting rooms, spaces for children's programs, and facilities for emergency services. Emma designed a memorial garden beside it, complete with a bronze plaque engraved with her words, "Water belongs to everyone." Communities are built by people who care more about tomorrow than today. A. William Sullivan, 1924 A 1954, and all who continue his work. On opening day, Emma, now healthy and stronger, stood beside me holding a new watercolor. This one showed the lake at sunrise, the community center in the background, and families gathered along the shore. At the bottom, she'd written, "Some things are worth fighting for." "Ready for the next adventure, Daddy?" she asked with a grin. I looked at the lake, the community center, the neighbors who had become family, and my daughter who had shown me that courage comes in all sizes. William Sullivan had built a dam for the good of the community. Karen Whitmore had tried to take it for herself. In the end, justice had prevailed, and the water still flowed for everyone. And yes, this time, I was ready.